When your shadow emerges uninvited, have you ever caught yourself reacting disproportionately to something seemingly trivial? A mild criticism that left you furious? A casual comment that triggered paralyzing insecurity? Or perhaps you've observed someone close to you, a partner, a parent, a friend, explode with an intensity that seemed completely disconnected from the initial trigger. What's happening in these moments isn't a mystery. It's your shadow emerging. And when it emerges uninvited, unrecognized, it doesn't come to dialogue. It comes to destroy. We all have parts of ourselves that we push into darkness. Impulses, desires, fears, and traits we consider unacceptable. We try to isolate them, deny them, pretend they don't exist. We build an acceptable personality and convince ourselves that's our whole story. But here's the brutal truth that Carl Jung, the pioneer of depth psychology, and Jordan Peterson, the contemporary psychologist and philosopher, understand with frightening clarity. What you deny doesn't disappear. What you repress doesn't dissolve. What you refuse to face gains strength in the shadows and eventually will emerge to sabotage exactly what you value most. Today, I'll show you why facing your own darkness isn't just an act of self-improvement. It's an absolute necessity if you want to protect what you love. And I'll guide you through concrete steps to begin this deep but essential work. Look, you don't have to handle everything, but if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're already doing more than half of humanity who prefer to pretend everything's fine while gossiping in WhatsApp groups. Subscribe to the channel. Here at least, you learn to face your demons with a bit of Jungian theory and reheated coffee. It's cheaper than therapy and maybe less painful. The shadow that rules you. Jung and Peterson's warning. When Carl Jung coined the term shadow, he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was identifying a real psychic structure, the repository of everything we deny being, everything we refuse to face, everything we fear others might see. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." This wasn't just a clinical insight, it was a warning. Jordan Peterson, deeply influenced by Jung's work, expanded this concept for our era. In his lectures and his book, 12 Rules for Life, he repeatedly emphasizes that what remains in the unconscious emerges as fate. Or put more directly, what you refuse to confront consciously will eventually dominate your life, often in catastrophic ways. But what exactly is this shadow, and how does it operate? How your shadow forms and grows. Your shadow begins forming in childhood, when certain emotions, impulses, or traits are punished or rejected by your environment. When your anger is met with, "Good girls don't get angry." When your vulnerability is answered with, "Real men don't cry." When your self-assertion is labeled as selfishness, you learn to hide these parts. You push them out of consciousness. The problem is that these parts don't disappear. They continue existing, now in the unconscious, where they operate without your conscious supervision. And there, as Jung observed, they can become distorted, primitive, and potentially destructive. A fascinating Harvard University study on emotional repression demonstrated that participants who consciously tried to suppress negative thoughts experienced a rebound effect. The very thoughts they tried to suppress returned with greater frequency and intensity. Even more revealing, their bodies still showed physiological signs of stress, even when they reported not consciously thinking about the suppressed material. In other words, what you repress doesn't just persist, it gains strength. Jung understood this phenomenon deeply. He saw that the shadow contains not only aspects considered negative, but also positive potentials that were rejected for not fitting the person's conscious identity. A man who identifies as rational and logical might relegate his intuition and sensitivity to the shadow. A woman who sees herself as a caretaker and selfless might repress her ambition and aggressiveness. Peterson expands this concept with his observation that the more you restrict the spectrum of what you consider acceptable in yourself, the more you strengthen precisely what you fear. In his lectures, he often uses the example of excessively agreeable people who refuse to acknowledge any aggressiveness in themselves, only to explode with disproportionate fury when finally provoked beyond their limit. A phenomenon he calls agreeable person syndrome. A University of Toronto study seems to confirm this. Researchers found that individuals who strongly identified as non-aggressive people were 62% more likely to exhibit chronic passive-aggressive behavior and 47% more likely to have extreme anger outbursts when their self-image was challenged, compared to those who acknowledged having aggressive impulses. The projection mechanism, seeing your shadow in others. The shadow doesn't just operate internally, it projects. Jung called projection an unconscious, automatic trick of the mind that allows us to transfer something that is in us to another person. When you have unrecognized shadow characteristics, you tend to see them disproportionately in others. This is why, as Peterson observes, you don't see the world as it is. You see the world as you are. The strongly moralistic person who vehemently condemns others' sexuality often discovers they carry repressed sexual desires. The harsh critic who finds fault in others usually deeply fears being judged themselves. The paranoid person who suspects everyone's motivations is projecting their own tendency toward manipulation. But the most dangerous aspect of the unrecognized shadow, which both Jung and Peterson emphasize, is its tendency to sabotage precisely what you value most. How your shadow destroys what you love. Jung observed that the unrecognized shadow is the enemy of your closest relationships. When you refuse to acknowledge certain impulses, qualities, or potentials in yourself, you tend to unconsciously choose partners who express these same traits, only to eventually resent the very qualities you secretly admire or desire in them. Peterson illustrates this with clinical examples from his practice. The man who doesn't recognize his own vulnerability selects a highly emotional partner, only to later despise her for being hypersensitive. The woman who denies her own ambition chooses a career-oriented partner, only to later resent him for being a workaholic. Research from the Gottman Institute, which studied couples over decades, revealed that 69% of recurring conflicts in long-term relationships are linked to unresolved shadow projections. The study concluded that the greatest predictor of divorce is not the frequency of conflict, but the presence of contempt, an emotion often directed at the very shadow qualities we don't recognize in ourselves. This destructive shadow dynamic extends beyond romantic relationships. Jung observed that parents tend to react most negatively to traits in their children that exist unrecognized in their own shadow. Peterson adds that what you don't acknowledge in yourself, you will criticize excessively in others, especially those who are most vulnerable to your influence, often your own children. A 15-year longitudinal study conducted by the University of Michigan found that specific traits parents consistently criticized in their children had a 76% likelihood of corresponding to qualities the parents themselves had repressed or denied in themselves. More concerning, children were 3 times more likely to develop anxiety and depression when the trait in question was in the parent's unrecognized shadow compared to when the parent acknowledged the same trait in themselves. The pattern is clear. What you deny in yourself, you attack in others. What you refuse to see controls you from the shadows. As Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Peterson puts it in even more direct terms. The truth that is not expressed transforms into vengeance. The unconfronted shadow always extracts its price. Practical application. Integrating your shadow. How then can we begin the essential work of recognizing and integrating our shadow? Here are 5 profound practices based on the teachings of Jung and Peterson. First, observe your disproportionate reactions. Jung considered intense or disproportionate emotional reactions as windows to the shadow. When you react with disproportionate intensity to something relatively minor, it's almost always your shadow being activated. Peterson addresses this in behavioral terms. Pay attention to what irritates you disproportionately. The reason something irritates you is because it's touching on something inside you that you don't want to see. Practical exercise. For 2 weeks, keep a trigger journal. When you notice an intense emotional reaction to something seemingly trivial, anger, fear, shame, anxiety, note it immediately. Describe the trigger, your reaction, and then ask, why does this affect me so deeply? What is this touching in me that I might be denying or repressing? For example, if you get intensely irritated with someone who expresses confidence, you might be denying your own need for recognition. If you feel disproportionate aversion to someone vulnerable, you might be repressing your own vulnerability. Second, identify your recurring judgments. Jung observed that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Your harshest judgments frequently reveal exactly what you're repressing. Peterson puts it succinctly: the things you hate most intensely in others are the things you can't handle in yourself. Practical exercise. List the 5 criticisms you most frequently make of others, whether in thought or expressed. Be brutally honest. No one will see this list but you. For each criticism, ask yourself, how might this also be true about me? Even if in subtle ways or in different contexts. This exercise often provokes significant internal resistance. You might think, but I never do that. This resistance is the signal that you're on the right track, approaching shadow material. Third, dialogue with your shadow. Jung developed a technique called active imagination, a form of conscious dialogue with unconscious aspects of the psyche. He believed that to integrate the shadow, we must first acknowledge it as part of us, not as an enemy to be defeated. Peterson complements this approach with his advice to treat yourself as someone you are responsible for. This means extending compassion to the parts of yourself that you fear or reject. Practical exercise. Set aside 20 uninterrupted minutes in a quiet space. On a sheet of paper, write a question addressed to your shadow. What do you want me to know? Or, what are you trying to tell me when you emerge? Then, allow yourself to write a response, not from your conscious mind, but letting emerge whatever comes. Alternate between questions and answers, maintaining an attitude of genuine curiosity, not judgment. Many people report surprise at what emerges, often insights and perspectives their conscious mind wouldn't have formulated. Fourth, identify your golden shadow. Jung recognized that the shadow contains not only negative qualities, but also positive potentials that were repressed. He called this the golden shadow, talents and capabilities that were denied because they didn't fit our self-image. Peterson addresses this phenomenon by saying that what you most need will be found where you least want to look. Practical exercise. Reflect on the people you intensely admire or envy. List 3 people, and for each one, identify the specific qualities you most admire in them. Now ask yourself, what would it be like if I allowed more of these qualities in my own life? What stops me from expressing these qualities? What beliefs or fears are blocking these potentials in me? This exercise often reveals repressed talents and capabilities that, once acknowledged, can profoundly transform your life. Fifth, practice integration through small actions. Jung emphasized that shadow integration isn't just an intellectual exercise. It requires action in the world. Recognizing shadow aspects isn't enough. They need conscious and constructive expression. Peterson expresses this as incorporating the monster, finding healthy ways to express shadow impulses, rather than repressing them until they destructively explode. Practical exercise. Identify one aspect of your shadow that you've begun to recognize through the previous exercises. Now create a small ritual or practice to give it healthy expression. If you've repressed anger, this might mean practicing martial arts or writing honest letters without sending them. If you've denied your creativity, it might be dedicating 15 minutes daily to some form of artistic expression without judgment. If you've repressed vulnerability, it might be sharing something genuine with a trusted person. The key is finding conscious and constructive expression for these energies, rather than allowing them to remain unconscious and potentially destructive. Real-life applications. Shadow work in action. Let's see how shadow work can be applied in 3 common situations. Situation 1. Recurring relationship conflicts. Typical pattern. You find yourself having the same conflict repeatedly with different partners. The details change, but the emotional theme remains constant. Jung Peterson perspective. Jung would say you're projecting unrecognized aspects of your shadow onto your partners. Peterson would add that you're unconsciously selecting partners who express qualities you've repressed in yourself. Transformative response. I notice I've repeatedly become irritated with partners for being too emotionally needy. Instead of automatically seeing this as their problem, I can ask myself, what does this reveal about me? Perhaps I'm repressing my own emotional needs and projecting them onto them. Instead of criticizing them, I can explore my own repressed vulnerability and learn to express my needs in healthy ways. This not only transforms my current relationships, but interrupts the pattern of attracting partners to project unrecognized aspects of myself. Situation 2. Intense reactions to your own children. Typical pattern. You become disproportionately irritated with certain behaviors in your children, even while intellectually recognizing their normal behaviors for their age. Jung Peterson perspective. Jung would observe that you're reacting to aspects of your own shadow that you see reflected in your children. Peterson would emphasize that by not acknowledging these aspects in yourself, you inadvertently teach your children to repress them too, perpetuating the cycle. Transformative response. I've noticed I get excessively angry when my child shows anxiety facing new challenges. Instead of just trying to correct this behavior, I can ask what it stirs up in me. I realize now that I grew up in an environment where my own anxiety was criticized, and I learned to completely repress it. I'm not just reacting to his behavior, I'm reacting to my own repressed anxiety that he brings to the surface. By acknowledging and making peace with my own anxiety, I can respond to his with more compassion, interrupting this intergenerational cycle. Situation 3. Self-sabotage of important goals. Typical pattern. You repeatedly sabotage your own goals when you're about to achieve them, whether through procrastination, self-destructive behaviors, or abandoning the goal without clear reason. Jung Peterson perspective. Jung would see this as a conflict between your conscious identity and unrecognized shadow aspects. Peterson would describe it as your map of the world, having internal inconsistencies that need resolving. Transformative response. I've realized that whenever I approach success in my career, I find ways to sabotage it. Reflecting more deeply, I recognize that I grew up with contradictory messages about success. On one hand, I was encouraged to seek achievements. On the other, there was a subtext that successful people are selfish or corrupt. Part of me desires success, while a shadow part associates success with becoming someone I don't admire. Instead of continuing this cycle, I can consciously redefine what success means to me, integrating both my ambition and my ethical values, allowing me to move forward without this internal conflict. The price of ignorance. What happens when you ignore your shadow? Let's recap the fundamental principles about shadow work. 1. Your shadow consists of aspects of yourself that you've repressed or denied, often since childhood. 2. What you don't consciously acknowledge doesn't disappear. It continues operating from the unconscious. 3. The unrecognized shadow tends to project onto others, especially those closest to you. 4. Your disproportionate emotional reactions are windows to the shadow. They reveal what you're denying in yourself. 5. The traits you criticize most in others often reflect repressed aspects of yourself. 6. The shadow contains not only negative qualities, but also positive potentials that were denied. The golden shadow. 7. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean being dominated by it, but consciously acknowledging it so it doesn't operate destructively. Jung summarized the danger of the unrecognized shadow powerfully. People do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And Peterson adds, if you don't know who you are, the world will give you an identity that's hard to bear. Both understand there's a high price to pay for ignoring our inner darkness. As Jung warned, when an unconscious content is about to become conscious, it always projects itself first onto the external world. In practical terms, this means that what you refuse to see in yourself will be experienced as coming from outside, as an enemy, a persecutor, an external force. Your own shadow energies, unrecognized, become the other, to be feared or fought. This is why Peterson often says, if you can't bite, you won't have teeth. Denying the shadow aspects of your nature doesn't eliminate them. It only ensures you won't have conscious control over them when they emerge. And they will inevitably emerge, often in your most important moments and relationships. As Jung observed, what you resist persists. What you accept transforms. A call to shadow. Integration. Protecting what you love. If there's one thing you take from this video, let it be this. Your unconfronted shadow will destroy exactly what you love most. Not because it's malevolent, but because it's energy-seeking expression and acknowledgement. Denied consciously, it will find unconscious expression. Think about the relationships that matter to you. Think about the achievements you work for. Think about the values you stand for. All of them are under threat, not from the outside world, but from your own unrecognized darkness. As Jung pointed out, the greatest danger we face comes not from outside, but from the wildness in our own hearts that we don't acknowledge. And as Peterson warns, the more you've denied the existence of the monster under your bed, the more terrible it will become. The invitation, or rather, the imperative, before you is clear. Face your darkness before it destroys what you love. Not after your relationship has crumbled. Not after you've sabotaged your career. Not after your children have absorbed your unexamined projections. Now, today, begin with one small act of brutal honesty with yourself. Ask, what am I refusing to see in myself? Which parts of my nature have I been denying? What do my most intense reactions reveal about my unexamined inner world? The path isn't easy, but the alternatives are far worse. As Jung said, there is no birth of consciousness without pain. Or, in words frequently quoted by Peterson, if you think slaying dragons is dangerous, try living an unconscious life. In our next video, why the wisest minds prefer solitude, the insight of Schopenhauer and Thoreau, we'll explore why great thinkers considered isolation not as a condition to be avoided, but as a sacred space for self-development. You'll discover how to cultivate a transformative relationship with solitude in a world that fears being alone. If this video resonated with you, share in the comments. I face my shadow to protect what I love. Let's see how many are ready for this essential but challenging work. Until our next meeting, our